It's a great privilege again to welcome Professor Kenneth Miller to give the second of his talks here during the Faraday Summer Course. Professor Miller is Professor of Biology at Brown University. He's a cell biologist. He's written a rather well-known textbook on cell biology that would be known to many people in that field. He was previously teaching at Harvard University. And he's written a best-selling book, which is, I hope, still on our bookstall, unless it's sold out, Darwin's God, and I hope that you'll certainly take a look at that book. It's gone through, I think, 25 printings we were hearing. Have I got the number right? I remember since yesterday, 25 printings, which is pretty good for a book on science religion, and it's a book particularly about intelligent design. And so we're delighted that Professor Miller is going to speak to us today on chance, necessity, and evolution. Thank you.
Well, thank you once again for that very kind introduction. I thought today I would remind you of a few things that I had talked about in the lecture yesterday regarding the opposition to evolution. So I'm going to reuse one or two slides, but that's all. And the slide I wish to start with is this slide with the rhetorical question that I posed yesterday, which is, why is evolution under attack? And many people who object to evolution would say the reason is very simple. It's a shaky scientific theory, and if a shaky scientific theory doesn't fit the facts, we should take it down. Fair enough. But in reality, evolution is singled out in the words of many of its opponents for a very simple reason. And it's singled out for the very simple reason that it is presumed, or its teaching is presumed to be the source of just about everything that is wrong with society, including, as you can see here, lawlessness, homosexuality, pornography, and abortion. And a more graphic representation of the same argument is put here, in which evolution is seen at the center of an epical conflict of worldviews between religious faith on one hand and humanism or secular humanism on the other side. And if one accepted the arguments that are inherent in this cartoon at face value, this would be a very serious battle indeed, because for the humanists to win would place all of these allegedly bad things up here as prime values in society, and would certainly change the way that we understand the social order. And this is one of the reasons why the stakes are indeed so high. Now, yesterday I spoke at some length about a conflict that erupted in a small town in the American state of Pennsylvania over the preparation of an intelligent design curriculum. The town was named Dover, good English name, but it's a very small town, about 14 or 15,000 people. This conflict was local, and it literally tore the local community apart. When the school board implemented this policy, a group of 11 parents who objected to it went to federal court, a national court, claiming that their First Amendment rights had been violated. A 6-week-long trial ensued, in which several people appeared as expert witnesses. I was one of them. This fellow here is Rob Pennock, who is a very well-known philosopher of science. In fact, I think one of his books is on the table over there, called Tower of Babel. Rob was instrumental in explaining what qualifies as science and what qualifies as belief. And I had the honor, once again, if that's the right word, of being the opening witness in the trial. And I spent 2 days on the witness stand. I actually had expected only to spend one day. That was Monday, the opening of the trial. I thought I would give my direct testimony in the morning, and then I would be cross-examined by the opposing side in the afternoon. I would then, Philadelphia is close to Providence, I would then fly back to Providence, and Tuesday afternoon I would give my normal lecture in my cell biology class in the fall. But as it turns out, my cross-examination went on and on and on, and by the end of the day, Monday, it was obvious I would spend all day Tuesday on the witness stand too, which I did. So I had to do something that I had never done in 25 years of teaching at my university, which was to cancel a scheduled lecture. So the class is not that large, about 40 students, so I emailed all of them to let them know why I wasn't coming to class. I sent them a copy of the science article from the journal Science about the trial, so they would know that their professor was not off skiing or vacationing, that I was actually doing something legitimate. I also sent them a link to the New York Times write-up of my testimony so they'd know that this was current. And I don't know if this impressed them at all, but they were not impressed until they saw that the trial was being covered in what is, for American college students, the ultimate news source. And those of you from North America will know what this is. Those of you who are not, I'll explain in a second, but right there is the ultimate news source. Now, this gentleman is named Jon Stewart. If you look very closely, you'll see a logo in the corner that says Comedy Central. This is a cable comedy channel in the US, and the program is called The Daily Show. And it is, self-described in the words of its host, a fake news show that treats news as satire to be ridiculed and sort of examined. It's among the most popular news shows among young people in the United States. In fact, it's probably the most popular one, and which tells you something about American television and public events. As you can see, he covered the trial, and therefore my students immediately thought, wow, this is really important. Now, for those of you who don't know this cable network in the US, this fake news show is followed by a fake interview show, which is known as the Colbert Report. And this is Stephen Colbert, who is an absolute comedy sensation in the United States. And he plays the part of what you might call a very conservative, very religious talk show host. And he plays this part for satirical effect. When the trial was over, he decided he wanted to have somebody from the trial on his show. And he has a reputation for just tearing guests apart, as you'll see. And guess which person from the trial was foolish enough to agree to go on his show? The answer was yes. It was me. Now, I hope that the nature of his humor will not be lost on the international crowd. I think not, but a little bit later on, I'm going to play this interview so you can see how this conversation about evolution goes. And I hope you'll enjoy it certainly as much as I did being on there. However, if you're interested in finding out what went on in this trial in detail, if you haven't seen it yet, the BBC Horizon series produced quite a good show on this that aired just about 12 months ago called A War on Science. And it was part of the BBC Horizon series. The program was really extremely well done. The crew spent a great deal of time getting the lay of the land in the rural Pennsylvania countryside where this is situated. They covered the courtroom drama, they covered the scientific issues, and they had the advantage also of having this struggle interpreted for them for audiences in the UK by Richard Attenborough and by Richard Dawkins. So I think it was really quite a well-done show. So if you want to catch up on this from the UK perspective, I couldn't recommend more highly this program on the BBC, A War on Science. Now, the main topic of what I want to talk about today is this issue of evolution, intelligent design, and what it means for faith or for theology, I guess in a formal sense. And what I want to start out by saying is this, and that is, if intelligent design were a philosophical view on the meaning and purpose of nature, if intelligent design, for example, merely claimed that the universe and all within it are the product of an intelligence beyond our understanding, then I would be an advocate of intelligent design, because that is indeed something I believe, and I believe very passionately, and I think is consistent with science. In reality, however, intelligent design is something else. And if you have access to the internet or a library that has American periodicals, I think the best straightforward, even-handed account, it's not a critical one, but an even-handed account of the intelligent design movement was done just about 2 years ago. This is August 2005 in the American news periodical Time magazine, the American edition. And they had a cover story on what was called Evolution Wars. And their subtitle was, "The push to teach intelligent design raises a question. Does God have a place in science class?" And that was really the issue that one had to struggle with in the Dover trial. And it's an issue that school boards, individuals, and communities throughout the United States continue to struggle with. Now, the reality is, remember I said I'd be an advocate of ID if it claimed that. The reality is, intelligent design is actually the claim that living organisms and complex structures within them were designed in acts of special creation. Now, why do I use the word special creation instead of design? Well, the answer is actually very simple. They claim, for example, that a complex biochemical motor, like the bacterial flagellum or complex proteins, were designed But when you think about what the word design means, if these objects had only been designed and had never been built, we wouldn't see them. So the notion of a design as being sufficient is only part of the story. If this building in which we sit today had been designed but never built, none of us would ever see it or know anything about it. This building, in fact, was created by the workers who put it together, working according to the design plans. What that means is that every time you see a claim for design in a biological object, it also, by definition, is a claim for the special creation of that object when the design is put into tangible form. So when one looks at complex biochemical systems, or when one looks at fossils of, let's say, the Cambrian explosion, and claims that these are the results of design, what one really means is that they were designed and then put into tangible form by an act of special creation. And this is what intelligent design is, and I think it's a fair and neutral reading of intelligent design. When one says the appearance of a new organism in the fossil record is the mark of design, what you actually mean is that it was designed and then put into tangible form by an act of special creation. And that is one of the reasons why I and others have been steadfast in identifying intelligent design as a form of creationism. Now that does not mean it's wrong. It simply means it is fairly described as an act of creation. Now, is there genuine scientific evidence of this? And this would be very interesting. The foremost advocate of intelligent design at the trial in Dover was Michael Behe, who's a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University. I know Dr. Behe very well. He and I have debated each other in print, in television, on radio many times. He's a very nice guy. On a personal level, we get along extremely well, but we completely differ on this issue. Dr. Behe had 3 full days on the witness stand in the Dover trial, and the judge allowed him to bring any evidence he wanted, scientific evidence, of intelligent design into the trial. In 3 days, he brought in 1 scientific paper. That's all. This was the scientific paper. It was published in 2004 in the journal called Protein Science, pretty good journal, and it was by himself and a colleague of his named David Stoke, simulating evolution by gene duplication of protein features that require multiple amino acid residues. Translated into plain English, Behe and Stoke ran a computer simulation in which they estimated the probability of what they called random Darwinian processes producing a new disulfide bond in a protein. This is a new covalent linkage that requires a specific amino acid called cysteine in one place and another cysteine in another place. And they asked basically, how long would it take for random processes to put this together? Well, I very carefully read through and analyzed this paper. And when I spoke to the attorneys for our side, I told them, when you get Dr. Behe on the stand, if he introduces this paper, here's what, as evidence for intelligent design, here's what you should do. Ask him to read a particular paragraph in the paper out loud. And they did. And here's what the paragraph said. We strongly emphasize, this is the author speaking, that the results bearing on the efficiency of this one pathway, random point mutations, as a conduit for Darwinian evolution, say little or nothing about the efficiency of other possible pathways. For example, our study examines the evolution of multiple residue protein features by point mutation in duplicate genes. And it doesn't indicate whether evolution of these features by other processes, such as recombination, insertion, deletions, or I would say sexual recombination, would be more or less efficient. In other words, to conduct this study, they ruled out what are generally understood to be the major mechanisms of evolutionary change. And not surprisingly, then, they discovered this sort of change is highly improbable. And the attorney just asked Dr. Behe about this in a very straightforward way. And he said, Dr. Behe, this means that this simulation did not examine a number of the mechanisms by which evolution actually operates. And Behe said, that's right. And this paper, and let's be clear about it, this paper doesn't say anything about intelligent design. You can scan this paper. Intelligent design is not in it. Behe said, yep, that's correct. And he tried to rescue himself by saying, well, it does imply irreducible complexity. I talked about that yesterday, but not intelligent design. But the lawyer said, no, wait a minute now, but it doesn't say intelligent design, does it? Behe said, that's correct. And that was the only scientific evidence that was actually brought in the trial as evidence for intelligent design. So in the final decision, at the end of the trial, a fair summary written by the judge in the case was this. On cross-examination, Dr. Behe admitted there are no peer-reviewed scientific articles by anybody advocating for intelligent design supported by pertinent experiments or calculations that would provide detailed, rigorous accounts of how the design of any system occurred. Dr. Behe also admitted there are no peer-reviewed papers supporting his claims about complex molecular systems, bacterial flagella, blood clotting, cascade immune system, and there are no peer-reviewed articles supporting his argument that certain complex structures are irreducibly complex. And the straightforward conclusion is, in addition to failing to produce papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals, intelligent design features absolutely no scientific research or testing. And this was based on the questions that went to Behe that said, you have argued that the bacterial flagellum is irreducibly complex, and you've argued that could be tested. Why haven't you done any experiments in 10 years to test it? And he said, I don't think my role in this is to do experiments. And that was, again, a very powerful statement to hear. Now, what we saw in this trial, and one of the things that is important, and if the new series that public broadcasting in the US is going to air in a couple months ever makes its way over to the UK, and BBC Horizons might pick it up, you will see that that decision is not just the arbitrary decision of a judge. That is simply what happened in the trial. And during the trial, all spectators said that what happened was intelligent design simply collapsed as anything resembling a scientific idea. It was obvious to every single person in the courtroom. So in that respect, I have told people the judge's decision was not unlike the referee's decision at the end of a boxing match, in which one boxer is on the canvas and the other one is still standing, and he raises the hand of the one that's still standing. That was very clear by the end of the trial. But the question I want to talk about today, and you can see some of the headlines in the local papers and the jubilation of the winning side afterwards, is what does this scientific collapse of intelligent design mean for faith? And I think that's something that should be interesting to all of us. There is a presumption of conflict that one sees everywhere. The notion that science and religion are inevitably in conflict, I think, is the driving force behind this struggle over evolution. If you type evolution versus creation into Google and you do an image search, you will come up with images like this on the web that weigh evolution and creation against each other, as if it is one or the other. My co-author, Joe Levine, who writes textbooks with me, knows that I use this slide in some of my talks, and he called me up a couple months ago and said, Ken, you know that balance slide you use with creation and evolution? I said, yeah. He says, you'll never guess the picture that appeared on the website of the science department of a Christian school in the Midwest. And he captured the picture and he sent it to me. And here's the picture. There's the teacher in the school. And if you saw it from the previous covers, that's the textbook that Joe Levine and I wrote. So that is our textbook. And you can see what it's being weighed against, just like in the scales. So it's either one or the other, and that's really the message of the teacher. Although Joe got a great deal of delight out of the fact that apparently it takes 2 Bibles to outweigh our textbook. So perhaps there's something there. But this symbolism of conflict is something you will find everywhere in the United States. And I'm sure many of you know the ichthus symbol, the symbol of the fish, which is often used as a Christian symbol of redemption. Well, evolutionary biologists, Darwinists you might call them, have a pretty good sense of humor. And a few years ago they decided to have a little fun with that. And they produced what is generally known as the Darwin fish, which is a fish with little incipient evolving legs. And you will see, believe me, you will see both of these as bumper stickers or license plate ornamentation on trucks and cars in the United States. Now, Christians, of course, have a pretty good sense of humor too. And when they saw the Darwin fish, they said, okay, we know how to handle that. And they produced a truth fish eating the Darwin fish. And if I had to show you which of these I might like to have on the back of my pickup truck, and yes, I do drive a pickup truck in the US, it would be this one with the Jesus fish kissing the Darwin fish. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, lots of you, of course, supervise students who are working for advanced degrees, and those students very often are looking for a thesis topic. And that's always difficult. That's one of the hardest parts about mentoring an advanced student, is finding the right thesis topic. So I'm going to help you out. I would suggest that you direct some of your students to writing their thesis on the iconography of the fish as it is used in predominantly Christian societies. And just to help you out, I have done a preliminary classification of this, and you can see it right here. Over here we have the religious clade. You've seen some of these already. Up here is the materialist clade, as it evolved with little tools and so forth. And my favorite, the culinary clade, is over here. And so forth. So you can break this down, and there's an even richer iconography than this. There is one of these icons that I've seen that I don't know how to classify. And there it is. It's the flying spaghetti monster that some of you may have heard of. And I don't know how to fit the flying spaghetti monster in. And I should also tell you that the day before the Dover trial ended, I was not at the trial, I was giving a seminar at Yeshiva University in New York, which is an Orthodox Jewish university, and a great one. And the students who saw this, I explained these are Christian symbols, but you'll understand them, and they did. And they came up to me, 3 or 4 students came up to me afterwards, and they said, we really liked the slide with the fish, and we appreciate it. I said, thank you. They said, but it's incomplete, because there's at least one more fish should be up there, and they're right. So they gave me this one, and there it is. It is the gefilte fish. I'm sure anyone who's ever had gefilte fish can appreciate what this is. It's a Jewish delicacy, very common in my country. And now with the help of the students at Yeshiva, I have a more complete slide. But I'm really quite serious about this as symbolism. Part of the entire strategy of the intelligent design movement is to portray evolution as anti-religious. Everyone familiar with the intelligent design movement in the United States would say, whether they're critics or supporters, that the intellectual father of the movement is Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson is a law professor. He's a law professor at the University of California at Berkeley. He's written a whole series of anti-evolution books, the most influential of which is probably called The Wedge of Truth. Now, he calls the strategy that he advocates in that book the wedge, because he wants to split science away from what he calls its foundations of philosophical naturalism. And his analogy is a wedge that can be used to split wood or to split a tree in half. And here's how he explains the idea behind the wedge, which is the main strategy for intelligent design. He says the objective of the wedge strategy, that's the objective of intelligent design, is to convince people that Darwinism is inherently atheistic. If we can do that, that will shift the debate from creationism versus evolution to the existence of God versus the non-existence of God. And that clearly is a debate that he thinks they can win. Then we can introduce people to the truth of the Bible, the question of sin, and finally introduce them to Jesus. Those may be laudable aims, but if anyone wondered if the intent of the intelligent design movement is fundamentally scientific or fundamentally religious in nature, Johnson speaks for the movement, believe me, and he makes it clear that his fundamental intent is religious. Now, I've got to go back. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you, and this is the reason I tried to explain what the Colbert Report is on this Comedy Central channel, is it's my experience that any discussion about evolution very quickly, in my country at least, turns to a discussion about religion. Always the question is, well, the science sounds good, but what about God? And I want to show you, this is about a 5-minute interview, I want to show you how quickly this discussion turned into a discussion about religion. So, in any event, I showed that, first of all, for entertainment value, but secondly, to let you see how even a very casual conversation, this certainly was casual, turns to that essential issue about evolution. What about God? And he came up with this issue right away. And that, I think, is the substance for many people of their objections to evolution. And it's a fact that there is no shortage of anti-religious statements that have been made by scientists. So, for example, David Hull, writing in the journal Nature several years ago, wrote this: whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural history may be like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He's not a loving God who cares about his productions. He isn't even the awful God portrayed in the book of Job. The God of the Galapagos, that's the God of evolution, is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He certainly is not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray. In short, God, if he exists, is a thoroughly nasty fellow. And that, presumably, is the message of evolutionary biology. Quite famously, Richard Dawkins has written, and he liked this phrase so much he put it in 2 of his books. He said that the universe we know about through evolution, the Darwinian universe we observe, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And every time I read that quotation, I'm amazed, because I know of no one who leads their life with a greater intensity of purpose than Richard Dawkins. Although Richard, to be fair, would say he didn't say that he had no purpose, he said the universe had no purpose. And I had suggested back to Richard that perhaps the purpose of the universe was to bring Richard Dawkins into existence. But we can debate that at a later time, presumably when the bar is open. Now, Dawkins has most recently, as you know, sharpened these criticisms of religion in his best-selling, and in the US at least, it has been near the top of the bestseller list. His best-selling book, The God Delusion, I think a more subtle and sophisticated attack on religion was written by Daniel Dennett, my countryman, who is a professor of philosophy at Tufts University, and most recently Christopher Hitchens, of course, has gotten into the fray as well. So we have seen an explosion of this sort of book, arguing not only, as Hitchens does, that religion ruins everything, but also that evolutionary biology pretty much does away with any need to examine the concept of God as a theological or a scientific possibility. Now, the assertions that all of these books have written underneath them is very clear. And that assertion is that science alone can lead us to truth regarding the purpose of existence. And of course, where it leads us is the assertion that existence does not have a purpose. And that presumably is something we can learn from science, that existence does not have a purpose. The reality is that statements like this are philosophical and not scientific in nature. Now, philosophical, you might think, what does a scientist think of scientist, an experimental scientist think of philosophy? The usual answer is not much. But in this particular context, when I say it's a philosophical statement, I don't mean it's wrong. I simply mean it is not testable by the methods of science. And therefore, a statement like these that you saw precedingly actually has no more scientific standing than a faith-based assertion on the nature of existence that I or some other scientist who is a person of faith might make. Now, that doesn't mean that we're right and Dawkins is wrong, or vice versa. It simply means that when he makes those arguments and when Dennett makes those arguments, they're not arguing scientifically, they are arguing philosophically. And that's a very important point in preserving what I would call the ideology-free character of experimental science itself. Now, most recently, and you've already heard me say on the screen what my faith is, when Pope Benedict was giving his coronation homily in Rome a couple of years ago, this was a remark that he made. And this was widely reported in press around the world. From my own mediocre German, I translated this in a pretty straightforward way, and that is, the Pope said that we are not the casual and pointless products of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary. When the intelligent design movement in the United States heard that, believe me, their blogs fired up, and they said, at last we have a Pope who is going to embrace intelligent design. And they anticipated that Benedict would ultimately turn out to be a powerful ally. When I looked at that statement, I thought the statement's most important line is not that we are not the products of evolution. It doesn't say that. It says we are not the casual and pointless products of evolution, and that is the key. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, because obviously the leader of the world's largest Christian denomination, his views on evolution are really quite influential, not just within this faith, but within other faiths as well. Now, there's a key observation in this, and the more that I read Pope Benedict's statements about this, the more I became aware that this is part of what bothers people about evolution. The claim that evolution is, as you often hear, a chance, random process, is really at the heart of objections to what people label as Darwinism. If you and I are just the results of a roll of the dice, what does that mean about the significance of our existence? And only about 2 years ago, a United States senator, a very conservative Republican senator and also a fellow Catholic named Rick Santorum, put this into words that I think are very apt and very well stated. So I'm going to play a clip from Senator Santorum appearing on radio in the United States. He had written a book called It Takes a Family, Conservatism and the Common Good, articulating his political philosophy. And one of the reasons he did this is because when this was originally aired in 2005, Santorum was anticipating a possible run for President of the United States. The voters in Pennsylvania, unfortunately for Senator Santorum, took care of that in November 2006 because they voted him out of office. And an unsuccessful senator is never going to have a chance to run for president, so that was the end of that. But his comments here, I thought, were right on the mark. So what I'd like to do is to play them for you. These are very brief.
Why does that particular item of the academic curriculum concern you as a United States senator? Why do those fall?
The item is evolution.
Consequences for society. I mean, it's where we come from. Does man have a purpose? Is there a purpose for our lives, or are we just simply, the result of chance? If we're the result of chance, if we're simply a mistake of nature, then that puts a different moral demand on us. In fact, it doesn't put a moral demand on us than if, in fact, we are a creation of a being that has moral demands.
And I listened to that and I thought, that's it. That's absolutely at the heart. Senator Santorum is a profoundly moral guy. What I mean by that is he openly articulates a moral philosophy and uses it to guide his political philosophy. And as I explained to students in the United States, morality is much more than just don't do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Morality is, what is the just society? How should one treat the poor? When should one go to war? What is the appropriate way to aid underdeveloped countries? These are all moral questions. And what Santorum is saying here is that if we are the result of Darwinian processes, which he describes as chance, then there are no moral demands on us. And what that means is not only that we're free to go out and party and drink and do everything we want, but it also means that the very notions of good and evil, right and wrong, are illusions. And for someone who had organized their entire life around a particular moral viewpoint, the notion that the very concept of good and evil is invalidated if Darwin was right is a profoundly threatening concept. And I thank Senator Santorum for putting that objection so straightforwardly, because I think it's at the heart of objections to evolution. Now let's go back to our friend Richard Dawkins' statement about the Darwinian universe. And again, that's exactly what he believes and that's exactly what he says. But is that indeed a scientific statement? And when Dawkins says it, he wraps it in a context that makes it sound scientific. But let's suppose I was to look at the thoughts of some other scientists. In particular, people like Francisco Ayala, a very famous population geneticist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the great figures in 20th century evolutionary biology, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, or John Haught, who to be fair is not a scientist but a theologian at Georgetown University in the United States. And let's suppose I decided I would put words in their mouth. And I've actually shown these words to two of them, and they said, yes, I'd be happy to say that. And asked them, look at the universe the way Richard Dawkins is. What would you say? And the words that I would put in their mouth are these. And that is that the Darwinian universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom the design of a provident and purposeful God intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world, because that's the one we have, and committed to a promise of freedom, which we also have, that makes genuine love possible. Now I believe that. That's not a scientific statement, but neither is Dawkins. And that is the key to understand these alternate ways of looking at the world that we see through science. Now, let me put this a little bit further. Let's suppose we start out on our planet, and we look, for example, 560 million years into the past to the animals of the Cambrian. And you see some of them here And these, incidentally, and I hope all of you recognize his stature, these were a couple of them discovered, most of them reinterpreted and reclassified by Simon Conway Morris, who is really one of the preeminent paleontologists in the world and did fundamental work about 20 years ago on the Burgess Shale, continues to do groundbreaking paleontology. If we now spin the clock forward 560 million years, what do we get? Well, we get a planet on which we have other organisms appearing, and these organisms appear in a pattern that actually allows us to trace our own ancestry to them. The fossil record of human evolution, especially in the last quarter century, has become astonishingly complete. The notion that there is some unbridgeable gap between ourselves and our pre-human ancestors is simply wrong. And when we simply lay out the specimens and the times in which they lived, what we see is that the confusion among human paleontologists is not, is there a pre-human ancestor we can link ourselves to, but rather, which of these is our great-grandfather and which of this is our second cousin and our fourth uncle and our crazy aunt up in the attic and that sort of stuff. But there's a very close and atypical bushy evolutionary tree that describes the emergence of our own species. So all of this has happened on our planet. And these records, these dates, these times, and these skulls are factual. How we connect the dots is interpretation. Now, key point, and something that Simon talked a great deal about yesterday. Evolution is indeed, as Stephen Jay Gould argued, inherently unpredictable in detail. Gould's metaphor is that if we rewind the tape of life back to the Cambrian and we let it run again, we are likely to get a different outcome. As a matter of detail, he's absolutely right about that, and I think Simon Conway Morris would agree. But as a matter of generality, I think he's wrong, and so does Conway Morris. Because what evolutionary processes do is they explore something that evolutionary theorists call adaptive space. Now, adaptive space is very difficult to visualize because it is multi-dimensional. But what one imagines in adaptive space is there's a certain style of living in which you make yourself green, photosynthetic, and extremely sexy. That style of living is called being a tree. A tree, even in a moderately successful reproductive year, can produce as many as 10,000 offsprings. That's why I say trees are very sexy indeed. There's another style of life in which you make yourself small, impossible to find, and reproducing at astonishing rates. And that is exemplified by the bacterium that is sitting on the tip of the fingernails of each of you right now. That works as well. There's another place in adaptive space for large predatory animals swimming in the oceans. In this aspect of adaptive space, the laws of hydrodynamics require that you should be torpedo-shaped, that you should have a fin in the back, whether it's horizontal or vertical, and that you should have stabilizer fins. That's simply the laws of hydrodynamics. Submarine designers follow those laws as well, and that's the reason why unrelated organisms like dolphins, ichthyosaurs, and sharks have this superficial similarity of convergence, which Simon Conway Morris talked about. These aspects of adaptive space produce a kind of evolutionary convergence, which has been championed by Conway Morris, and the reason is that evolution arrives at similar solutions, shapes, sizes, and styles of life for similar regions of adaptive space. So, I would argue, and Simon certainly has argued brilliantly in print, that if one took Gould's experiment and wound the tape of life back to the Cambrian and let it run again, Gould is right, you're not going to get the same outcome. But you will see the same regions of adaptive space filled with the same kinds of organisms. They might not be mammals and reptiles and amphibians, but you would still see organisms that conform to the size and the shape and the style of life specified by natural selection in those regions of adaptive space. Now what that means, in a sense, is what I would call the evolutionary design of life is an inherent part of the fabric of the natural world. In other words, the capacity for evolution is in fact built into the planet and the natural world in which we live. Now, one often hears this word about chance or random evolution. And the notion that evolution is random is not at all the same as the scientific observation that evolution is in fact undirected. We cannot detect a direction or an order in which mutations appear or change occurs. But natural selection, which is really the key part of evolution, isn't random at all. and natural selection is driven by natural law. And it is natural selection in different regions of adaptive space that drives the evolutionary convergence that we see across all aspects of paleontology and natural history. Now, the necessity of all of this is that the filling of these evolutionary niches, these are these different regions of adaptive space, and I would argue, and so did Simon, including the emergence of sentient, self-aware organisms, that's what we are, allegedly, is directly driven by the physical constants of our universe. In other words, the capacity to evolve something like human beings. It doesn't have to be hairless bipedal primates, but the capacity to evolve sentient, self-aware beings is built into the fabric, the physical constants of the universe. In other words, the emergence of the living world, very much like the one we inhabit, is not at all a random accident, but is an outcome that is made possible, one can argue about this, possible if not inevitable by the fabric of nature itself. And I like the slide that Simon showed yesterday in which he imagined visiting a planet other than Earth and coming across a scene on the beach where you have apparently a blue-eyed, blonde-haired Norwegian child playing in the surf and saying this would probably happen somewhere else. Well, I'm not sure about the Norwegian child and the surf, but I am sure about this general idea, which is this filling of niches in adaptive space is an inherent consequence of evolutionary laws and the playing out of the physical constants of our universe. In short, in a sense, one might say, the universe is such that we were meant to be here. Now, I actually talked about this issue with Steve Gould, who was a friend of mine before he passed away. And Steve would say you could never use evolution as the tool to fulfill the intent of a creator. Because if you wound the tape back, that comet that destroyed the dinosaurs might not hit. And instead of hairless bipedal primates, that would be us, occupying this niche, you might get big-brained dinosaurs, or you might get large-brained birds. And my answer to Steve was, how do we know that the designer or the creator wanted primates? He might have been very happy with bipedal, big-brained dinosaurs, because the issue of us is not, when Scripture says that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that does not mean that God is a primate. The image and likeness is a spiritual one, and that spiritual one would apply as well to the kind of organism that today we call a bird, or the kind of organism that today we call a reptile. It's not our mammalness that makes us special. It is our self-awareness, our ability to reason, and our sentient powers that make us special. Now, let's get back to the question that was considered in the preceding lecture. Does this mean that evolution, if, for example, it can explain the tendencies of the human brain to accept, and some would say to invent religion, thereby invalidates religious belief itself as a mere artifact of natural selection? And that, of course, was the topic of the talk that you heard previously. Well, there's a very interesting article that was written in the US in the New York Times Sunday magazine called Why Do We Believe? Actually, the title of the article was Darwin's God. When I first saw that, I thought I was going to sue for plagiarism, the title of my own book. But it was a very interesting article, and it is still freely available over the web, anywhere in the world, if you go to the New York Times website or you type in this title. And at first I thought I was not going to appreciate the article. The reason for that, you can see the subtitle. In the world of evolutionary biology, the question is not whether God exists, but rather why we believe in him. Is belief a helpful adaptation or an evolutionary accident? In other words, I assume the article will take it for granted that there is no God and simply would puzzle over the question, as you heard formulated previously, is why people are so foolish as to believe in God. Well, it turned out it was a little more sophisticated than I expected. And the article, in fact, handled this in a very interesting way. What is the better biological explanation for belief? Is it an evolutionary adaptation or is it a neurological accident? Is there something about the way our brain works that makes us receptive to belief in a supernatural? And here, for me, this is the key question. If scientists are able to explain God, what then? Is explaining religion the same thing as explaining it away? And that's really a key question. In short, are we hardwired to believe in God? And if we are, how and why did that happen? Now, towards the end of the article, I thought there was an extraordinary series of quotations and discussions by the author. And the author in particular pointed out Justin Barrett at Oxford, whose name you heard mentioned in the last talk as well, and pointed out that one prominent member of the byproduct camp, this is the camp that argues that the capacity for religious faith is actually a byproduct of the natural selection that produce our species, is Justin Barrett. And Barrett, paradoxically, according to the author, is an observant Christian who believes in an all-knowing, all-powerful God who brought the universe into existence. And he wrote to the author by email and said, I believe that the purpose for people is to love God and love one another. Now, the author then wrote, this seems confusing. How does his view of God as a byproduct of our mental architecture coexist with his Christianity? Why doesn't the byproduct theory turn him into a skeptic? And then Barrett wrote, and I rather like this, Christian theology teaches that people were crafted by God to be in a loving relationship with him and with other people. Why wouldn't God then design us in such a way as to find belief in a divinity quite natural? And I think that's a key point for anyone who is a theist. And then he goes on, and since my wife and I celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary just a few months ago, boy did this hit home, having a scientific explanation for mental phenomena does not mean we should stop believing in them. Suppose science produces a convincing account for why I think my wife loves me. Should I then stop believing that she actually does? And I think that is very much akin to questions about religion. So these ultimate questions of whether or not evolutionary biology can explain the capacity for religious faith, which clearly is universal in our species, fall, in my opinion, very far short of being anything that invalidates that belief. And a simple way of putting that is that if you find it acceptable scientifically and theologically that a creator would have used evolution to fashion our bodies, why would it be so surprising that he would have used evolution to fashion our minds from which religious belief grows? And I think that's a very powerful question to put to skeptics. I would say the key question for all of us is whether science carries us as deeply into the mystery of life as we truly wish to go. And I would also argue that people of faith of all denominations would argue that it does not, that science does not answer every question that is worth answering. Now, saying that is not a rejection of science. I'm a scientist. I've spent my life working in science, and God willing, I will spend the rest of my life working in science. I'm not about to reject science. But being a scientist and being committed to that passionately is not the same thing as thinking that there are no questions that science cannot approach. I think there are many. This is not a rejection of science, but simply a recognition of its limitations. And I think that an understanding of the validity of this choice, you don't have to agree with it, just that this is a point upon which reasonable people can differ, is the first step to making peace between science and religion, a peace which I think is very much to be desired, certainly in my country, and I would argue certainly in Europe and other parts of the world as well. Now, one often says, well, okay, that's fine, but I don't understand God that way. And for Christians and for Jews, I turn to our scripture and say, wait a minute now. The Abrahamic conception of God is a God who makes all things new. He renews the face of the earth. I don't think this is a God who would have imprinted this sort of static and inflexible order into the living world, made it one way, unable to change. And he certainly is not one who could have created only in the sort of clumsy ways that we humans create. And my scriptural backup for that is from the book of Isaiah, which is one of my favorite books in Scripture. And as you know, parts of Isaiah are a long and contentious dialogue between God and Isaiah. And at certain points, God has just had it with Isaiah, and he just lets him have it. And at this point, he says, look, buddy, look, Isaiah, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are my ways your ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, my ways are higher than yours, and my thoughts are higher than yours. God is telling Isaiah, don't think that I'm operating on the same level as you are. I can do things in different ways, and I can think things in different ways. So those of us who try to look at the world and say, how would God have done it? Inevitably, we are thinking like human beings. And we have a very clear warning in Isaiah from the Lord, don't think that I am bound by your ways of thinking and your ways of doing. So again, the criticism that evolution isn't the way that you might think God would have done it, Isaiah has God telling us, don't assume that I have to act the way that you would prefer. Another person has said that evolution really ought not to be used to draw anti-theological conclusions. That person, of course, was Charles Darwin. And in The Origin of Species, he anticipated this problem. He said, I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock anybody's feeling. He'd been corresponding with someone else, he said, and he's gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of a deity to think that he created a few original forms capable of self-development, that's evolution, into other and needful forms, as to believe that he required fresh acts of creation to supply the voids caused by the actions of his laws. In other words, to keep creating new species every time one of his creatures went extinct due to the actions of natural law. Darwin was gravitated back and forth between being agnostic, being a theist, and simply being confused. He struggled greatly with the question of religion, but he never, ever allowed his ideas to be used directly in opposition to religion, something that all too few people today appreciate about Charles Darwin. Now, does this mean that I am arguing, as a person of faith or as a Christian, that the Bible should be used as a scientific textbook? And if you heard me talk yesterday, you know the answer is, of course not. But I want to let you know I'm not the first person to say that either. This is from St. Augustine, written in 411 AD. Augustine, one of the earliest and most influential of all the Christian writers, from a book of his known as On the Literal Meaning of Genesis. And we'll hear about Genesis, of course, later today. But I absolutely love this admonition from Augustine. And you can read this yourself. But as you read it, I'm going to translate it into what I think is 21st century English to get the sense of it. So you take a look at it, see if I get the translation right. Even a non-believer can study geology, astronomy, zoology, botany, and other scientific fields. And that non-believer can gain scientific knowledge from observation and experiment. Now, the worst thing that could happen would be for that non-believer to hear a person of faith presumably explaining the meaning of the Bible, talking nonsense on these scientific topics. And we have to do everything we can to prevent the embarrassment of skeptics showing scientific ignorance in a Christian and laughing it to scorn. So what Augustine was telling believers in the 4th century, he wasn't worried about evolution. What he was telling believers, in the 5th century, was very clear. And that is, if you use Scripture, sacred text, to make scientific statements about the earth, the heavens, or animals and plants, in other words, biology, and you're wrong, the non-believer will assume you are equally wrong about the really important message of Scripture, which is the message of salvation. And therefore, we have to do everything we can to prevent Christians from doing it. Augustine also pointed out that there is a way to understand creation that is profoundly different from what fundamentalist Christians would argue is necessary today. I always tell my fundamentalist brothers and sisters, read Augustine. Augustine wrote, the universe was brought into being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted by the Creator with the capacity to transform itself from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structure and life forms. Every cosmologist and every evolutionary biologist I know would be happy with that quotation. But I have to tell you, when I talk to purely scientific audiences, they usually like what I have to say right up to the point where I read a psalm or I quote from Augustine. And then I can see them squirming a little bit. And they begin to wonder, what kind of science would you get if you followed the admonitions of a weird 5th century North African mystic like Augustine? And I think that is a fair question. So I think it deserves a fair answer. And I want to show you what Augustinian science actually means. And I can think of no better example than taking a religious person who went into the priesthood in an order founded according to the teachings of St. Augustine. Now this guy who went in was very religious, devoted his life to his faith, and he did very well. He was highly regarded by his peers. In fact, he became the abbot of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn, a very religious person. Now, at one point in his life, he got interested in what today we would identify as a scientific question. And that question was, how do plants pass their characteristics along from one generation to another? So how did he answer that question? Did he read Scripture? Well, we know he did, because he had to read Scripture every day for the Roman office. Did he pray? We know he prayed, because one of his duties was to lead his monastery in prayer. But when he wanted to answer the scientific question, he didn't look in Scripture. he didn't rely only on prayer. He went out into the garden and he did experiments. That Augustinian priest was Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. So the answer to what kind of science you get if you follow Augustinian precepts is very simple. You get darn good science, you get genetics. And that's as profound a statement as I can make about the ultimate compatibility of science and religion. Now, this is a point that has been taken up by many people in the scientific community. There was a wonderful letter written to Nature in September last year when this became an issue. And the title of the letter was "Dogma Not Faith is the Barrier to Scientific Inquiry." And he pointed out that in a very famous article, Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the great evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, had written, and this is a quotation you'll see everywhere in research laboratories and biology departments around the world, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." It's a very profound quote. It's one of the reasons why biologists defend evolution so passionately. In the same article, Dobzhansky wrote, "It's wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive." And then he said, "I am a creationist and an evolutionist. And the reason for that is that evolution is God's or nature's method of creation." And he said, "The Creator has made the living world not by caprice or supernatural fiat," I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. And that was Dobzhansky as a man of faith and also as a man of science. More recently, this has been popularized by one of the most famous biologists in the world, Francis Collins, the head of the international, he's the head of the American aspect of the Human Genome Project, and really the acknowledged worldwide leader of the efforts to coordinate international laboratories to sequence the human genome. He's recently written an absolutely marvelous book called The Language of God, which I'm very happy to see was over on the table here, and I'd recommend this for anyone who puzzles at how a top-notch scientist and an absolute uncompromising evolutionist, and that's what Collins is, could reconcile that with his faith. And Collins, incidentally, is an evangelical Christian, and a very, very sincere and profound one who's done missionary work and lives his life according to the precepts of the faith in a way that I admire and stand absolutely in awe of. But nonetheless, you keep coming back to this question. How can a Christian, or for that matter a Jew, or for that matter a Muslim, accept evolution when it seems to contradict the history of creation in Genesis, when it seems to go against references to Adam and Eve that appear in all three of the great Abrahamic faiths? And that's a very good question. Now I'm going to answer it with quotations from thinkers from my own faith, but I think these are generally applicable to all of the Abrahamic faiths. And I'm going to start out with a very distinguished scientist named Georges Lemaitre. Lemaitre was actually a parish priest. I believe he's from Belgium, and it turns out that if you weren't here, I wouldn't have been thinking, is he from Belgium? Yes, I think so. Okay, so happy to do it. See, I told you it was an exciting little country, not a boring one. Lemaitre is the person who originated the scientific theory that today we call the Big Bang. And he was the person who realized, not Einstein, he was the person who realized that Einstein's mathematical formulation implied a singularity or a beginning to existence. And Einstein at first resisted this and later saw that Lemaitre's calculations in mathematics were absolutely correct. Now, needless to say, Lemaitre, being a priest, was often asked about this. And he said, look, the writers of the Bible were illuminated, more or less, some more than others, on the question of salvation. On other questions, they were just as wise or as ignorant as anybody else. So it's utterly unimportant that errors of historic or scientific fact should be found in the Bible, especially if those errors relate to events that were not directly observed by those who wrote about them. The authors of Scripture in all of the Abrahamic faiths didn't have the evidence in front of them that Charles Darwin did. The idea that because they were right in the doctrine of immortality and salvation, they must also be right on all other subjects is simply a fallacy of people who have an incomplete understanding of why Scripture was given to us at all. And I think Lemaitre put it extremely well. John Paul II put it, I think, even more cogently when he wrote to the Pontifical Academy and said, the Bible speaks to us of the origin of the universe and its makeup, not to give us a scientific treatise, but rather to state the correct relationships of man with God and with the universe. Any other teaching about the origin and makeup of the universe is alien to the intentions of the Bible, which does not wish to teach how heaven was made, but rather how one goes to heaven. to paraphrase many other people who've made a similar statement before. Now, I have a quiz for you. About a year ago, a geneticist at my university, Michael McEwen, very famous Drosophila geneticist, found this paragraph, and he emailed it to me and said, Ken, I want you to guess who wrote this. And again, I wouldn't read the whole thing. I'll do a quick paraphrase. Universe 15 billion years ago, Big Bang. Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. Little consensus about where the first living cell came from, but general agreement. First organism dwelled on this planet 3.5, 4 billion years ago. Since it has been demonstrated that all living organisms on Earth are genetically related, it is virtually certain that all living organisms have descended from this first organism. That's as good a one-paragraph summary of the natural history of our universe as I've ever seen. I tried to guess who wrote it, and I got it wrong. Maybe some of you have got it right. This guy wrote it. He wrote it 3 years ago when he was known as Joseph Ratzinger, and it was in a report called Communion and Stewardship, published by the Vatican, the International Theological Commission. Now, to be fair, he didn't actually write it. He chaired the committee and signed off on the report that wrote it, so it clearly reflects his thinking. And many people are surprised when they would see the current Pope write something like that, but they'd be even more surprised if they went from paragraph 63 to paragraph 69. Benedict and the other people on the commission knew what was going on in the US right now, our big struggle with intelligent design. And here's what he said. The current debate about mechanisms of evolution requires theological comment because it implies a misunderstanding of the nature of divine causality. Many neo-Darwinian scientists, that's their code word for scientists who say evolution disproves God, as well as some of their critics, those are the intelligent design people, argue that if evolution is a radically contingent, unpredictable, material process driven by natural selection and random genetic variation, there's no place in it for divine causality. But then he says, according to our understanding of divine causality, true contingency, unpredictability in the created order is not incompatible with a purposeful divine providence. Thus, even the outcome of a truly contingent natural process, and that is exactly what evolution is, can nonetheless fall within God's providential plan for creation. Now, I understand that he is only the spiritual leader of some people of faith on this planet, but nonetheless, no one would argue that this guy was not serious about religion and had thought serious about this particular issue. And that's the point to be made. And more recently, just a couple of days ago, and I thank the good Lord for internet access right here in this room so I can download these new articles, Pope Benedict has said that basically the notion that there is a clash or a conflict of creation and evolution is an absurdity. Debaters wrongly present the two sides as if they were alternatives that are exclusive. Whoever believes in the Creator could not believe in evolution. Whoever asserts belief in evolution has to disbelieve in God. This contrast is an absurdity because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality that we must see and a reality that enriches our understanding of life and being. Couldn't have put it better myself. The view that evolution and religion are compatible is widely shared. I won't read this quotation to you, but if any of you are interested in serious, hardcore theology, and I certainly am not a theologian, I would recommend this book, God After Darwin, A Theology of Evolution. It was written by John Haught, that's as in haughty without the Y, which is the way he describes it. And John is very well informed on biology and describes the living characteristics of God like this, and I think it's really quite well done. So it's a reading recommendation. I also want to show you a columnist in the United States, Charles Krauthammer, who put this better than I ever could. At the conclusion of that trial in Pennsylvania I kept referring to, he wrote this column in the Washington Post, one of the most important newspapers in the United States. Now, for those of you who don't know him, Charles Krauthammer is probably the most conservative columnist who writes for the Washington Post. He and George Will are their two extremely well-known conservative voices. At the end of the Dover trial, his column was entitled Phony Theory, False Conflict. And here's the way he put it. How ridiculous to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more economical, more creative, indeed more divine, than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct and yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas. I can think of no better way to summarize an understanding of evolution than words that were written by the person who kept this notebook and wrote this sketch on a very famous page in the notebook, and which I had the privilege finally last year of actually seeing in front of me, which was a very exciting experience, because this is the first sketch that anyone had ever drawn of what is today recognized as an evolutionary tree. And you can see on the page this guy wrote, "I think," and then sketched out the tree and described the tenets of evolution. He did this in 1839, 20 years before The Origin of Species was published. And this person did not see evolution as demeaning or depressing. He saw it quite differently. And what he wrote was, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and I think those are words to live by. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much indeed. So we got a bit of time for questions. Yeah, Dennis. Yeah.
Ken, wonderful presentation. Thank you. With regards to the Augustine quote, the paragraph that follows right after that is, "Reckless and incompetent expounders of Holy Scripture bring untold trouble
and sorrow on their wiser brethren when they are caught in one of their mischievous false opinions
You're
and
such an evangelical.
and are taken to tasks by those who are enemies of Scripture." It's just great.
Absolutely, and in many ways, I think that's the problem. And thank you for Ernest, who's going to be coming up with the exegetical side. I really think from an evangelical perspective, and of course that's the tradition I'm closest aligned with, that's the problem. How do you deal with the hermeneutics of Genesis 1 to 11? And how do we make it accessible to the average person?
I quite agree. And I routinely lecture at self-identified Christian colleges, and I will always get the question, if the Bible is not true in its first book, then how do we know it's true in the Gospels? And therefore, the belief system is that all of Scripture is the Word of God to be uncritically accepted. And as an antidote to that, I always suggest that people read the book of Job. And there are several passages in Job, and as you know, that really is an intense dialogue on the nature of evil, meditation on the nature of evil, dialogue between God and Job. And at one point, God has lost patience with Job, and he yells down at him basically, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I threw the stars into the heaven?" And here's the interesting part. "Have you seen the storehouses in which I build up the snow and hail? Have you seen the cisterns from which I pour down the rain?" Now, if you think that's scientifically true, don't worry about evolution. You have a problem with meteorology. Because if you accepted that as scientifically correct, you'd be flying up there looking for the cisterns that hold the rain. Well, that's absolute nonsense. So how does a biblical literist interpret that? And the answer is very simple. The book of Job is a meditation on faith and the nature of evil. And the writer was ignorant of the tales of meteorology, and therefore put this in as a metaphor to show God controlling the weather. Fine. So it's allegorical, poetic language which focuses on a deeper message, which is theodicies, the nature of evil. Well, you know what? So's Genesis. That's the point.
And we will be coming back to that in some detail at 2 o'clock. So, as you say, yes.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'm having a bit of a crisis of faith here, because I used to believe I was an intelligent designer. And now maybe I think I'm...
Getting less intelligent as the time goes
but maybe more intelligent.
Okay. But as I confessed at the very beginning, and believe me, there are some extremists within the scientific community have accused me of being an intelligent designer, for the very simple reason that I would say, if this is what intelligent design meant, I would be an advocate of it too. Go ahead.
Okay. So can I? I'll ask my question now. I guess the couple of phrases you used seem to be the key focal points. I think special creation is one phrase you use. I'm not sure what it means. And truly contingent, that what the Pope said. it would be interesting to understand exactly what he meant by that, because of course a lot of atheists are using that contingency to suggest naturalism or atheism.
Okay, now I think I can answer both of those things. Now, the truly contingent, what was the first part? Oh, special creation.
Right.
The word special in special creation does not come as it's classically used from extra special or really neat or anything like that. Special means species. So special creation means the individual, instantaneous, one at a time, creation of individual species. That's what special creation means. So that is entirely at variance with everything we understand about evolutionary biology, that individual species appear instantaneously as acts of special intent from a divine power. So that's what special creation means. And I'm careful to use the word special creation as opposed to creation, because I think any theist ultimately is a creationist in the broadest sense, in that creation is my answer to why there is something rather than nothing.
Right.
Okay?
I don't think intelligent designers, or at least all of them, would agree with that. That's what.
Oh, I know they wouldn't agree with it.
Right.
The issue is not whether they would agree. The issue is, would a reasonable person think it's a fair characterization? And I think it is. And then on the issue of, what was the second one? Truly contingent. The reference in the International Theological Commission report, and there is a footnote reference to that, is to several passages in Aquinas. In other words, when they talk about contingency in nature. And Aquinas wrote on essentially today what we would call chance and necessity. And Hutt treats this very well in his book, God After Darwin. Aquinas realized that a world that had no chance, where nothing happened, would in effect be a world that was where nothing happened on its own, would be totally at the mercy of initial conditions and its creator. Couldn't really be an independent world. So to establish a degree of independence in his creation, God would have had to have built an element of randomness and chance into it. And therefore, Aquinas' reasoning, and this is always the way Aquinas reasoned, was to take the alternative and see where it leads you. In a creation where nothing happened by chance, the creator would be completely in control. Free will and free choice would be an impossibility in such a world. That would not be as perfect a creation as one in which freedom, chance, and uncontrolled events could actually happen. And therefore, the inclusion of these contingent processes in the natural world, and I think is the way Aquinas said it, are a necessary part of any creation by a good and gracious God. So, again, and I can give you the reference to that International Theological Commission report, and their citing is right back to Aquinas. So this comes from very traditional Christian thinking about the independence of creation from its creator.
Thank you. Jeff. Yep.
Ken, I want to follow up on your recent comment, and I love the point, by the way, that the idea of design doesn't just involve the plan, but it involves the instantiation of the plan. So that does seem to be special creationism in its essence. I think that's fair, and there are many ID advocates who actually would acknowledge that it's an accurate depiction of their views. So Steve Meyer, for example, very explicitly asserts that he's a progressive creationist. He thinks God meddled with creation at the point of every new thing, including, he believes, every new species of frog. So that's a lot of creations. And the point I want you to comment on, though, is Mike Behe would not consent to that. And he would think your characterization is unfair.
For him.
For him.
I would not characterize Mike that way.
Right. Okay. So, although he believes the flagellum is designed, he didn't think God meddled to create a flagellum. He believes that God front-loaded, which in a sense is maybe even more difficult to imagine. That in the very first form of life, there were the genes for flagella and blood clotting and the retina of the eye, and then it seems you almost need a miracle of preservation of all this inert genetic material for 4 billion years. But nevertheless, what would you say to Behe's claim that, no, I'm not a special creationist, except in the very limited sense that I believe, as Darwin said at the end of The Origin, that God breathed life in, and after that, let it run?
Well, first of all, Behe's most recent book, which is called The Edge of Evolution, concedes even more than that. Behe, in fact, not only admits but argues for common descent. So he argues, for example, for the common descent of our species and other primates, and he actually puts in there diagrams that are based on diagrams from my papers. God bless him, he can have them, indicating how strong the evidence for common descent is between us and other primates. So that's all terrific. But what he also says, that any evolutionary change above the level of, somewhere between genus and order, in other words, the classic classifications, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Species and genus, maybe evolution can do that, Darwinian evolution. But any change above that that produces a new order, like the order of mammals or the order of reptiles, or certainly a new class, like the class Chordata, or any of the other insect classes, of which there are many, or even higher at the level of the phylum, these require design. So Behe himself, and he has a wonderful diagram in his book, it's very clear, showing that any evolution that results in anything up in these higher taxonomic orders requires design. And by design he means somebody has to go in there and intentionally tinker with what he regards as highly improbable mutations to get them to produce the fundamental changes in body plan that define the different phylum. Now, what I would tell
He
Mike...
doesn't believe in common descent, by naturalistic.
He believes in common descent in a sense that no biologist would recognize it, which is you have a common ancestor who then has many descendants, and the designer then goes in and, sorry, there's no other word for it, supernaturally inserts the appropriate mutations and rearrangements on the same material to produce an entirely new body plan. Now, he would say that's common descent because the designer is working with existing material, so that's why the marks of common descent, which no biochemist could deny, are still there. But he argues, and I know no other word for it, that you need supernatural forces in order to drive that descent. And I think when advocates of intelligent design like Stephen Meyer, if they carefully and honestly think about Behe's ideas, they will find them frightening. And I certainly know the scientific community finds them to have absolutely no merit.
Meyer does find them frightening.
Yeah.
He thinks they're completely untenable.
But Behe has suffered the misfortune of having his book reviewed in the journal Science by Sean Carroll, in the journal Nature by me, gotta feel sorry for him, and in the New York Times by Richard Dawkins. And I do have to say that the Dawkins review of Behe's book is just about the least nasty book review by Dawkins that I have ever read. For some reason, he was highly restrained, extremely critical, but highly restrained on a personal level, and that surprised me actually, because I expected the full Dawkins to come out, and Richard was notably restrained.
I think Behe's idea of evolution is rather like evolution of motor cars, isn't it? You know, you sort of have a.
I think that's a fair statement. Yeah.
That's sort of an analogy. Yes.
Yeah, which is
Yes.
you know, the people at Vauxhall or BMW are looking at last year's model and saying, what shall we improve? Taking the basic chassis, tinkering with the engine a little bit, rearranging the dashboard, and you can clearly see the evolution of the model.
Yes.
Come to that conclusion. I haven't read his recent book, but in Darwin's Black Box, that wasn't his view. I think it actually was even more ludicrous. It was that in the original Model A, there was all the material, the information necessary to generate what we now have, and just by using it over time, it became what we now have.
Yeah, so that original Model A had the genes for the turbocharger, the continuously variable transmission, radial
GPS
tires,
system long before
you know, so,
there was...
and I pointed out in a review of that book back then, this is a biological impossibility
Yeah, right.
in genetics. And since then, when I bring that up, I have been told that me pointing that as an unfair criticism, because Behe only meant that as an example, and he's retracted that as a serious proposal.
Bill, and then Dennis.
One of the things I admired most about your book was that you devoted about equal amounts of time to critiquing the ID movement, but also critiquing the scientific establishment, if we want to call it that, where atheism and atheistic ideology is packaged into science. And a lot of your involvement is in political dialogues with the ID people and debates with them. But I'm curious what your personal experience is with political dialogues and debates with the other side, with the atheistic establishment, in a sense.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you that those people have done tremendous damage to science in the United States, by, in some ways, they've fallen into Philip Johnson's trap, right? They've played along with it. Because to the extent that atheistic ideology is packaged with evolution, then it's very damaging to science in the long run. Science will be very damaged in the United States and probably everywhere in the world. Do you have any success in getting people to see this all?
I think so.
I've had limited success in my own experience.
Yeah,
with my colleagues at Stanford.
Well, I think so. And I think there's an increasing awareness in the mainstream scientific community that this is a genuine danger. So, for example, about 5 years ago, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, which is the largest scientific organization in the world, established a committee called DOSER, or an initiative called DOSER, which stands for Dialogue on Ethics, Science, and Religion, DOSER. And I'm a member of the steering committee of DOSER, and one of the regular programs that we is to hold seminars and meetings and publish papers on the science-religion interface. When AAAS decided to form DOSER, science was filled up for about 2 weeks with nasty letters from members of the association saying, what are you guys doing? Is a witchcraft committee going to be next? Are we going to resurrect the philosopher's stone? This is, all religion is superstition, we should have nothing to do with it, and so forth. But the mainstream people in the society said, wait a minute now, we live in a country where 90% of the people say they believe in God. If science cannot effectively dialogue and interface with religion in a society like ours, long-term science will be the loser. So as DOSER has proceeded and has conducted these events and these programs, it's won more and more respect from AAAS to the point where I don't think there is that hostility that is there today. In terms of how I've personally been received, I would say that about when I'm out in, anyone knows who's ever been on television, for the next 2 days you get hundreds of letters and emails. You get old friends looking you up and all this other sort of stuff. And certainly when you write a book or a prominent article, you get feedback. When you get quoted in the newspaper, you get feedback. I would say 85% of the letters I get from scientific colleagues are entirely favorable. They either say, I agree with you completely, or, well, I'm an atheist or an agnostic, but I agree with your statements that atheism is not a scientific proposition, therefore science should not allow, all this other sort of stuff. So that's wonderful. Another 5% says I'm going to burn in hell. I always reply to those, maybe so. But if I do, it won't be on account of evolution. It would be because something else I've done that you don't actually know anything about. And I leave that to their speculation. But another 5 or 10% are from people in the scientific community. And I remember one in particular that said, I don't know what diploma mill gave you your PhD, but whichever one it was, send it back. Because as soon as a scientist starts to speak favorably of religion, he's no longer a scientist, and you don't deserve scientific credentials. So you do hear that. But in the mainstream scientific establishment, one of the things I can tell you is I'm very well known from shooting my mouth off in this stuff as a theist and also as a defender of evolution. 2 years ago, I got the presidential citation of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. This year, I received the Public Service Award from the American Society for Cell Biology. I was asked to give the annual director's lecture at the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and other people involved in this case have been similarly honored and appreciated. So I think, and our whole strategy in this court case was to argue for the ultimate compatibility of science and religion. So I see as part of my job, and I bet you do too, is to educate my colleagues into abandoning a kind of self-destructive philosophy that is, first of all, philosophically invalid, and secondly, in the long-term disinterest of the scientific establishment in general. So I concur with you.
I think Dennis had a question.
Just a caveat with regards to Jeff's talking about black box in 96. Here, Behe is now in 07. I debated him in 99, and his position, so it went from the supercell to now a form of progressive creationism. And the position he was at in 99, he said it could all be front-loaded, that is with regards to design. It could have been intervened at different times in history. And then he goes, my official position at that time is I'm agnostic. So what you're seeing is an interesting intellectual evolution going on in the guy himself.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, we've got a panel tonight. I hope you're going to keep filling up that box with lots of questions. And this has been a great talk and a great discussion. Thanks very much, Ken.
Thank you.